Şimdi oturumumuzun ikinci sunumunu yapmak üzere Eunomia Araştırma ve Danışmanlık, Çevre Politikası ve Ekonomi Müdürü Chris Sherrington'u ulusal depozito iadesi sistemi uygulama modelleri konusunda sunumunu yapmak üzere sahneye davet ediyorum.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking about deposit return system design options and the implications, because deposit systems are not just one shape or size. The mechanism, the incentive mechanism, the desire to get your money back is consistent across all applications. But across the world, where deposit systems are put in place, they're done in very different ways. Sometimes it's subtly different, sometimes it's fairly obvious. Some of these systems work well, and the design features are really well thought through and positive. Others work less well. So I'm going to talk through some of the different approaches and give you some things to think about in terms of how a system could work well in Turkey. So just firstly, a little bit about Eunomia. We're still a fairly small environmental consultancy. I joined about 10 years ago, and there are about 17 of us. There's about 90 at the moment, so we are growing fairly quickly. We're based in the UK. We have several offices in the UK, but we now have offices as well in Brussels, in Athens, in New York, and in New Zealand, in Auckland as well. And we do a lot of work for a number of different clients. We work for the European Commission on a lot of studies. We also work for private clients. We work for producers. And we work across a whole range of issues relating to waste prevention, waste management, and recycling. But in recent years, deposits have become an increasingly important part of our work. So this is, I'm not going to talk through all of these examples, but just in broad terms, we've looked at a number of existing schemes. We've undertaken design studies for new schemes. So in the United States, there's quite a few systems that have been in place for quite a long time. And there's some design features there which we wouldn't particularly recommend be applied in new schemes when they're set up. So we've got a fairly good idea of how those schemes are set up and the problems with them and how you might go about modernizing some of those systems. We've also looked at the European examples, so Norway, Estonia, Lithuania. We have a good understanding of those schemes, and we're involved in quite a few design studies, certainly in the last year or two with the Single-Use Plastics Directive. There's a real interest in getting these schemes in place. We're also looking further overseas. We're working in Indonesia, where we see that the deposit mechanism could work really effectively to tackle some of the serious issues there in terms of marine plastics in particular. So what is a deposit return system? I think we're all pretty clear on that already. Typically it applies to beverage containers. It could, in principle, apply to all sorts of other items, packaging items and beyond packaging as well. For example, small electronic devices could usefully have a deposit applied to them because we want to get a lot of these things back rather than have them sit in your cupboards at home. So the mechanism can be applied more broadly. Typically it's beverage containers because these are consumed at high volume. They're an important component of litter, and also they're often fairly clean at the end of life. So it is applied to those. The refundable deposit is really important. There are some examples where efforts are made to incentivize higher levels of recycling by providing a reward for recycling. Now, a reward on its own is not at all as effective as the incentive to get your money back. If you've paid your money in the deposit, theory suggests and evidence shows you're going to work harder to get your deposit back than to seek a gain of the same value. So this is well known in theory and it's viewed in practice. So this is the particular strength of a deposit return system. We've talked about often there are dual aims for a deposit system. It's both to increase the recycling, get the really high quality material back, but also to tackle litter. And I think in recent years, the litter has been a real, the public have really understood this issue, and it's been one of the key drivers. So in terms of benefits, litter reduction is a fairly immediately obvious one to the public, and the evidence reviewed suggests that you can achieve around 90–95% reduction in the littering of deposit-bearing containers. Now, this has important knock-on effects because deposit-bearing containers, plastic bottles, aluminium cans, glass bottles, they're high volume, so they're highly visible items, and they make up probably about 40% of litter by volume. And we know that the likelihood that someone will litter is affected by how littered, how messy the environment is around them. So if you can make a significant reduction in visible litter, if you can make the area cleaner through a deposit system, chances are that you are going to have a knock-on effect. It stops people littering other items that are not bearing deposits. Reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We just heard the example from Norway about how you can really improve material efficiency and the greenhouse gas emissions. Increased opportunities for employment, and importantly, the high-quality material that can then be reincorporated into new food packaging, into new beverage containers with recycled content. For the beverage industry, it's an effective means to discharge extended producer responsibility that they have. Sometimes you hear it said that you have deposit systems and extended producer responsibility systems. What people are talking about there, because a deposit system is a form of extended producer responsibility. It is a very pure form of extended producer responsibility in that the polluter pays, the producer funds it overall, and the good citizen is rewarded if they pick up the bottle and return it. So it's got it is extended producer responsibility. What people are generally talking about when they make a distinction between the two is the deposit system and the existing PRO-funded or local authority-funded collection system for recycling. For retailers, we've heard from the Norwegian example that they're compensated. They have a handling fee to cover their costs. And this is something that's often not understood when deposit systems are suggested. So that the handling fee is a significant part of the cost of the system, and it's an important point to convey to retailers when first talking about implementing a deposit. For the government, we have the reduced cost of dealing with the residual waste and the litter costs. So for the municipalities, there will be a reduced financial burden. And this is all part of the wider shift through extended producer responsibility mechanisms of the burden away from taxpayers and citizens to producers and consumers. So it's not an increase in cost, it's a shift of the costs. And it's shifting the costs in a way that is fairer, and it leads to a much more cost-effective way of dealing with the issues that we face. So litter, this is an infographic that we produced a couple of years ago to try and bring together what was known about marine plastics, looking at where they come from and where they end up, and looking at the overall scale of the issue as well. So at the time, there was a lot of excitement about the ocean cleanup, which was Boy and Slat's mission to go and clean up the Pacific, because there was this generally accepted idea that all the plastics that went into the sea ended up in the mid-ocean. Now, if that were true, maybe that would be a sensible way of approaching it. But we looked at the concentration, and we found that only 1% of the plastics going in end up at the ocean surface, so across the entire ocean. Many plastics sink in water, so they get biofouled, and they end up underwater, so they're not at the surface anymore. And actually, the majority do end up on the seabed. But the concentration is really interesting. The highest concentration of plastics in the center of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch was 18 kilograms per square kilometer. So if you're looking for an efficient way to get plastics, getting a boat going out to the mid-Pacific is not where you'd start. But this is where a lot of effort was being focused. Beaches, by contrast, the concentration is much greater. So if you're going to pick up plastic bottles and other litter in the marine environment, beaches are a good place to start if you're talking about marine litter. Better still is to prevent it becoming litter in the first place. And even better if you can prevent the litter and keep hold of the materials and recycle them. But this is something that has really captured the public imagination, and it was one of the key drivers for the Single-Use Plastics Directive at the EU level. So just to look at the data from beach litter, of all the items found on EU beaches, so this is from the various regional seas, 82% of all the items found were plastic. Of those items that are plastic, the vast majority were what is termed general plastic, so not fishing related. And of those, the bulk are single-use plastics. Okay, so they are a significant contributor to beach litter. And if you focus on the particular items, you can see that drinks bottles, caps and lids are the most prevalent item. So it is an issue that needs to be tackled, and it is being tackled at the EU level. And this is a pattern that we see beyond Europe, around the world. This is information from the International Coastal Cleanup. So we have cigarette butts are reported as the most prevalent item. But if you add up the beverage-related litter, you have plastic beverage bottles, plastic bottle caps, glass beverage bottles, metal bottle caps. Yeah, again, it is the sector that's contributing the most to it. And this is a more recent example of the same survey. So these trends do continue. So with all the focus on marine litter, it's really important not to forget the importance of land-based litter, because this is what people experience in their everyday lives. And we do know from the academic literature that it affects how people feel about their environment. It affects their feeling of safety, and I think to an extent it reflects a certain... People like to feel as though they're in control of their own environment. I think when things are littered, they feel that they don't have that control, and it is something that affects people's well-being. It's also really expensive to clean up. Litter is dispersed, and it's, again, if you're trying to manage resources, you don't want to walk around picking things up on the floor. And the neighbourhood disamenity, this is that sense of how it affects people's well-being, and also how it affects things like house prices and fear of crime, and also there's associations with criminal activity with more littered environments, because people feel that no one's taking care for the environment that they're in. We also have, this is from a study in the UK recently. Obviously, wildlife is facing numerous threats, changing climate, habitat destruction, and this is something that can be addressed. We have beverage containers that are trapping small animals, and again, it's something that this is avoidable. So we've heard also that we get very high return rates from deposit systems. This is I think we had these figures shown earlier. And in the US, we have an interesting comparison of the containers that are returned from within a deposit system and the return rates for containers that are outside of the deposit system. And it's pretty compelling, the difference in those. Now, this is a slide that we've tried to improve over recent months because it tells an important story, but it's not a story that's easily told. So I'll take this slowly. What we're showing here is the cumulative impacts of the importance of really high recycling rates and how that affects the demand over time for virgin material. So, oops, wrong one. So if you imagine you start with 1,000 bottles. If you have a 10% recycling rate, you get the material back for 100 bottles with the first round of recycling. Then you get material back for 10 bottles for the next round of recycling, and then you're left with material for 1 bottle. So you quickly, at only a 10% recycling rate, you quickly end up going through all the original material you had, and there's a need for bringing in lots of virgin material. If you start with 1,000 and you have a 90% recycling rate, you get back enough material for 900 in the first round. At the next iteration, you get 810, and so on. So you're getting, the cumulative impact is really significant. So when you hear people saying, we've gone from 50% to 60% recycling rate, isn't that great? You think, well, actually, it's not as great as going from 80 to 90. So these higher recycling rates are really important. We heard about how the increased deposit level in Norway is just eking up. You know, the recycling rates are going to hit 90%. It's really significant. You know, we look at the greenhouse gas impacts from higher levels of recycled content. It's really important to aim high and achieve these rates. There's also often concerns about the impacts on the existing collection system. So this is from work we did in the UK, where we don't quite have the form of producer responsibility for the curbside collection yet that you would ideally have, and it's mostly funded by taxpayers, by the municipalities. So there has been concern about if you have a deposit system in the UK, what's it going to do to the revenues? Do you take all the good material out? And it is entirely possible to reconfigure the collection systems to collect more of other materials and to allay those costs. And ultimately, if it's funded by the producers, it's not a concern for the local authorities anymore. But it's something that, it's an issue that can readily be addressed, given the time to change it. So in terms of design options, the governance of the system is really important, how you set the system up, you know, who runs it, who oversees it. A broad choice, it could be state-run or industry-run. There's considerations about the degrees of design flexibility that you might have. Some of the US systems, you have the deposit level is set in law. And in some cases, the deposit level was set in law in the 1970s at 5 cents. And it hasn't been possible to change that ever since. So inflation has eroded the value of the deposit. So it's really important to have a flexible system where the system operator can adapt it to become ever more efficient. The question also of, is it a centralized operator or a decentralized system? We have examples of both. Fraud prevention is a consideration to be taken into account. What kind of mechanism are you going to use for this? How much are you going to spend trying to tackle fraud? And statutory targets are an important external influence on the deposit system. You know, there's no point just saying, have a deposit system, try and do well with it. You need an external influence, be it through a target with penalties for not achieving it, or a tax, as is the case in Norway. So all these different issues about governance have implications for, is it genuine producer responsibility, the transparency and the accountability of the system, the efficiency and the ability for the system to adapt over time, and ultimately the success. You know, if you want a successful system, which will be measured by a high return rate and a producer fee that's as low as it can be, these things need to be considered. So in terms of governance, we've heard a lot about Norway in the previous example, but you know, this is an example we see as a really good option for governance, in that it's run by a central system operator. There's clear responsibility on that system operator that arranges all the logistics, all the finances and data are managed by that one central operator. And there's transparency. We have the annual accounts, the data is published, so the information is made available to verify that what is being claimed is actually happening. The system is set up and owned by industry, so it's not state-run, it's industry-owned and run, and it's not for profit. So the incentive here is, because it's owned by industry, the incentive is to deliver the responsibilities as cheaply as possible. And obviously, in Norway's case, it's with the incentive provided by the tax. It is to achieve as high a rate as possible, given the incentive provided. Yeah, it's trying to achieve the target that makes most financial sense, which I've just said, just there. So Estonia is also another good example where you have one system operator. Similar to Norway in that regard, doesn't have the same kind of tax incentive, but there are criminal penalties for non-compliance which are passed through to the system. So alternative approaches, I mentioned that the United States gives us examples of approaches not to apply. So Connecticut This is one where there's no single organisation with responsibility for the success of the system. So this is not a good place from which to start. The individual beverage companies organise their own logistics and the money flows. And the government has fixed the elements of the system that you'd want to flex in legislation. So it means there's really limited ability to change this system. There are no targets, which are essential, and there's very limited oversight. So this is not an example of a good system. And one of the issues here is you don't have the transparency, and the way the costs are apportioned they're not apportioned in a way that could be considered fair. Hawaii has gone for a different approach. This is state-run. So it's actually not an example of extended producer responsibility. The producers are not funding this. It's funded by government and consumers. So the consumers are paying to an extent, but it doesn't give the same incentives, and it's not transferring the costs in the same way. So I'm not going to explain all of the lines here, but this is a central system operator approach. But I think the important thing is the data. So the blue lines are the data, and this all comes to the central system operator. So they have the understanding of what is going on. Connecticut, we have this system that's decentralized, and again, we have bits of information, but they're not together. So no one has a clear overview of what is going on for the system as a whole. Another important consideration is the level of the deposit. So if you're looking to incentivize returns, all else being equal, the higher the deposit, the harder people are going to work to get their money back. So it will incentivize a higher return rate. You need to balance this against the risk of fraud, because the more attractive it is through a higher deposit to defraud the system, the more enticed people will be to try their luck. And the fraud can take place in a number of ways. It could be that the deposit's not initiated in the first place when it's put onto the market. It could be people trying to return containers several times. Or it could be containers that actually aren't within the system. They're never designed to be in the system. They're seeking to return them in that way. So the deposit level, there's a number of considerations to take into account. It should be proportionate to the cost of the beverage container, of the beverage itself. You wouldn't want a deposit that's more expensive than the drink that's being purchased. We have a very low level in the United States, and we have a higher level in Germany. The level in some of the US states is because it was fixed in the 1970s. Germany has a much higher one. And again, that has really interesting implications in terms of the propensity for fraud and the way in which you might seek to address those concerns. So we do see a relationship between the deposit level and the return rate. So, as we explained, all else being equal, the higher the deposit level, the higher the return rate. But there's other factors that are important as well. So the convenience of the return infrastructure is one of those. So the return infrastructure is another consideration in the system design. We have return to retail options, or we have return to depot options, which are more favored in the United States. So for retailers, we have the consideration, is it all shops, or is it only the large shops? In Norway, it's all shops, which makes it as convenient for the consumer as possible. Various other approaches have minimized the requirements for smaller retailers to take back, and their rationale for doing that is based on considerations of fairness. But as mentioned, the retailers are paid a handling fee, and that is designed not only to compensate them, but also to incentivize the most efficient operation of the system as a whole. So the manual or automated approaches have different implications for cost and for fraud, and also the employment and the subsequent logistics. So the compacting RVMs, for example, they significantly reduce the volume, which has a knock-on effect on the logistics. So the handling fee can be used to incentivize the use of compacting RVMs where this makes sense for the system as a whole. So the redemption centers, so where you don't have return to retail, or you have the option of return to retail and redemption centers, these can be run by the system operator or contracted businesses. Again, the considerations here are sort of the cost and the convenience for the system and for the consumers. And they can be manual in terms of the take-back or automated as well. So in terms of the handling fee, what we see as best practice is where it's the handling fee, ultimately it's a negotiation, but it's based on a calculation of what is the cost to the retailer of taking back the containers. So this will be a combination of the space that's taken up for the RVM or for just storage or just the manual take-back, staff costs, and also the cost of purchasing or leasing the RVM, if that's the approach that's taken. And again, the handling fee is something you don't want to fix in legislation. It's something that needs to be flexed as the system evolves to increase the efficiency. And these should be kept open to review. You know, on an annual basis, handling fees are often reviewed, and I believe they've actually been reduced in places where it's determined that the retailers are actually being overcompensated. So handling fees are really important because they are a significant component of the cost of the overall system. So this is a typical split where handling fees might make up about 70% of the cost. And this will vary by country and by the approaches taken. You have costs for transport as well, and costs for the counting centres where the manually collected containers are taken for verification. So in terms of the funding, that's the cost of the system. There's a number of sources for the funding, one of which is material ownership, and the material collected under the deposit system is really high quality compared to that collected from elsewhere. So the best practice, as we see it, is where it's returned to the system operator. They are responsible for marketing that material to get the best price, and this will help to offset the producer fee paid by those placing the containers on the market, with the revenues, going to support the system as a whole. So this is an example of the split in Norway. So we have the material revenues accounting for just over a third of the overall system cost. Unredeemed deposits is the other important funding source. And producer fees are used to top up the shortfall between the overall cost of the system and what comes in from the unredeemed deposits and the material revenue. So we have the producer fees are obviously one of the three funding sources. And best practice is the minimum level to cover the costs after the material and the unredeemed deposits. And these should be differentiated by container type, so reflecting the value of the material at the end of life. So we should avoid cross-subsidy between the different material types. So the revenue from aluminium cans should go to offset the producer fee for aluminium cans. The revenue from PET should go to offset the revenue, the producer fee for PET. And interestingly, you can use, the Norwegian example is a good one here. You can modulate the fees. You can set constraints on what kind of design is allowed in the system and use the fees to further incentivize the design for recyclability. So to design out, to incentivize the removal of disruptors from the recycling process. So this is what we see in Norway. We have some of the fees here. But then you have the additional fee for the plastic sleeve, so looking to dissuade the use of a plastic sleeve on the can. For plastics, we have an additional fee for light blue, an additional fee for coloured plastics. So we're trying to, and this is something that can be flexed over time, to try and basically reduce the overall system costs by this financial incentive. There's also an additional fee for a standard barcode. So this is the choice of whether you have a national barcode or an international barcode. And it also reflects the benefits to the system as a whole for compacting the material. There's onward efficiency in terms of the logistics. And we have a similar thing in Estonia. So in terms of a Turkish DRS, we've undertaken an initial design study to look at the design features that should be applied and understand the relative costs and impacts of a deposit scheme. So just in terms of the overall findings, the scope is for plastic, metal and glass containers. We have modelled a target return rate of 90%. So we know this is a considerable uplift from the recycling rates achieved at the moment, but a deposit return system can do this. There's no need to be any less ambitious on this. We have the number of beverage containers flowing through the system and the material weight. We've calculated a retailer handling fee, and the two levels there are for the compacting RVMs and for the manual return. And in terms of the producer fee, we've identified a net cost per container, as shown here. The system will lead to significant annual CO2 reductions compared to the baseline situation, and will also bring about significant reduction in the tonnage of litter in Turkey. Thank you very much.